All right, today we're going to tackle one of the most loaded words in the English language, socialism. But look, this isn't about scoring political points. We're simply going to crack open a book, Danny Katch's Socialism, seriously, and explore the ideas inside. We're here to see what makes this particular take so fresh and, honestly, pretty surprising. And right off the bat, you get the feeling this isn't going to be some dense, dusty textbook. I mean, when the author Anand Gopal calls it the most fun and accessible introduction he's ever read, that tells you something. The whole approach here is to use a bit of humor and a lot of clarity to start a conversation, not just throw a lecture at you.
So the big question is, what really makes this take on socialism different from all the stereotypes you've probably heard? How does it manage to reframe these really old ideas for the world we're living in right now? Well, let's dive in and find out.
Okay, so the book starts in a really unexpected place. We don't begin with a dry history lesson or some complicated theory. Instead, it just asks us to use our imagination for a minute, to picture what a totally different kind of society might actually feel like to live in. It drops us into Philadelphia in the year 2040. And in this vision, you've got express trams zipping along on roads that are now totally car-free. People don't just have one boring job for their entire life. They might be a teacher for a few years, then an urban wildfire fighter, or maybe an elder story recorder. The point is variety. And even workplaces set aside time for creative projects. Now, it's not some perfect, flawless utopia. People still argue about stuff, like housing and energy, but the real difference is how they solve these problems, through local community assemblies, through democratic committees. It's a society that's just built on a completely different set of priorities. So as soon as you start imagining a different world like that, you immediately run headfirst into a really common roadblock. And that's the argument that our current system, capitalism, is just the way it is because, well, that's just human nature. You've heard it a million times, right? People are just naturally greedy, naturally competitive, and that's that. The book has a great name for this idea. It calls it the Agent Smith theory, after the villain from The Matrix. It's that cynical view that says humans are just wired to be destructive, and our society is the natural, inevitable result. So, according to this theory, any attempt to change things is just naive, because you can't change our fundamental nature. But here's how the book pushes back on that. It basically says, look, if you zoom out and look at the whole sweep of human history, this idea of a fixed human nature just doesn't really hold up. Our societies are in constant flux. I mean, think about it. Industrial capitalism has only been the dominant system for about 200 years. That's just a tiny, tiny sliver of human history. And this timeline really puts it into perspective. For hundreds of thousands of years, we lived in foraging societies, which were often pretty egalitarian. Then you had the rise of agriculture, and eventually feudalism dominated Europe for centuries. The point the book makes is that just like feudalism got replaced by capitalism, our current system isn't some endpoint. It's just one more phase in a really long story of how human societies change and evolve. So if human nature isn't some fixed barrier to change, what about the other big concern, power? A lot of people hear socialism and they immediately picture a huge, oppressive, all-powerful government. The book gets this, and it tackles that fear head-on by first asking, well, where does power actually sit in our current system? The argument in the book is that the state, under capitalism, isn't some neutral referee. It actually pulls out this famous line from Marx and Engels, who called the state a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. In plain English, that means the wealthy, business-owning class. The core idea here is that the state's number one job ends up being the protection of corporate and business interests, often over the interests of everybody else. Okay, so if that's the problem, what's the solution? What's the alternative? The book actually looks back in history for a totally different model of what democracy could be. Karl Marx wrote this while he was watching this incredible radical experiment unfold in France back in 1871. He saw it as something completely new, a real departure from a system where you just get to pick which person is going to misrepresent you for the next few years. So the vision of government presented in the book isn't about a more powerful state. It's actually about a radical expansion of democracy built from the ground up. It points to real historical examples like the Paris Commune, where all the officials were paid no more than an average worker's wage and, get this, could be recalled from their job at any time by the people who elected them. Or you have the early Russian Soviets, which were basically councils of workers that grew so powerful they created a situation called dual power. They were like a competing government, directly challenging the old one. The whole focus is on direct participation and real accountability. Okay, this brings us to one of the most personal and, let's be honest, most common fears people have when they hear the word socialism. What's going to happen to my stuff?
The book playfully calls this the toothbrush question. And yeah, it sounds a little silly, but it comes from a very real anxiety about losing your own personal space, your autonomy, your things. Are they going to take your phone, your car, your toothbrush? The book argues this fear comes from a pretty big misunderstanding. So the book makes this really crucial distinction between two different kinds of property. On one hand, you have personal property. That's your stuff. Your phone, your clothes, your car, your toothbrush. The book says socialism has no interest in that. The focus is on what it calls private property. That's the big stuff, the means of producing wealth for society. We're talking factories, office buildings, corporate farms. The argument is that those things, which generate society's wealth, should be owned and controlled democratically by all of us, not just by a handful of private individuals.
All right, let's talk about another big stereotype the book tackles. It's that image of socialism as this gray, drab, boring world of forced sameness, where your individuality gets crushed so that everyone can be equally miserable. And the book brings up this classic quote from Kurt Vonnegut's short story Harrison Bergeron, because it perfectly captures that fear. This is that dystopian vision, right? Where equality just means dragging everyone down to the lowest possible level, where any kind of unique talent or beauty is seen as a threat that has to be stamped out. But then, to completely flip that idea on its head, the book shows us this first-hand account from George Orwell. When he was in revolutionary Barcelona during the Spanish Civil War, he didn't see dreary uniformity. He saw the exact opposite. He saw a place filled with newfound dignity, where people finally treated each other as equals. For him, it wasn't drab at all. It was vibrant, it was inspiring, and it was something worth fighting for. And far from crushing creativity, the book argues that these moments of massive social change have often unleashed it in this incredible way. It points to the early Russian Revolution, where there was this absolute explosion of art and culture. You had avant-garde artists decorating public squares, ballets and theaters that were once only for the super rich were suddenly open to everyone. The argument is simple. When you take away the profit motive and break down these rigid social hierarchies, you don't get blandness, you get a cultural boom.
So, after chipping away at all these myths and stereotypes, we get to the bottom line. What's the ultimate goal here, according to the book? What's the whole point of all this?
And the book's answer is maybe its most important point. It doesn't present socialism as some perfect, finished blueprint that has all the answers. Not at all. Instead, it frames it as an ongoing process, a constant struggle, really, to figure out how we can live together in a more just, more democratic, and more humane way. It's more about the journey of asking those questions than having some final destination.
And in the end, the book leaves us with this really powerful question. It doesn't pretend to have everything figured out. Instead, it just encourages us to think for ourselves. By challenging so many of our deep-seated assumptions, it forces us to ask, if we're not happy with the way things are now, what could a real, viable alternative actually look like? What would a society truly run by and for ordinary people be like? It's a pretty big question, and definitely one worth thinking about. Thanks for joining us for this explainer.